Okay, it is 7 o'clock, so I am going to get us started. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Menaka Thiru. I am the Community Engagement Librarian at the Anchorage Public Library, and I am so glad to have you all here today for this very important discussion. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that I am calling in from the traditional unceded lands of the Dena'ina. If you are not calling in from Anchorage, we would love for you to just share in the chat what lands you are calling in from along with your name. That would be fantastic. This panel discussion is part of the Anchorage Reads program, which is actually just wrapping up. It was a 5-month program that started back in February, and we have been collectively reading together the book Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. And we have also been having these panel discussions on a variety of different topics. And so if you're interested in learning more about the program or viewing some of the recordings from some of our past programs, I'll share the link with you in the chat for the website so that you can view those recordings. This program is also being recorded so that you can share it with any of your friends or colleagues who might be interested in viewing it afterwards, but who couldn't make it tonight. So thank you again for joining us. I really want to thank the ACLU for hosting tonight, and I'm going to toss it over to Megan, who will be facilitating the discussion.
Thanks, Menaka. And thanks everybody for joining us. Welcome. I appreciate the fact that this is how you're choosing to spend your Thursday evening. This is a really important conversation. My name is Megan Edge. I am the ACLU of Alaska's Communications Director. I use she, her pronouns, and I am joining you from my home on Dena'ina land as well. I've had a privilege of living here my whole life, and I'm forever grateful to that. Today, I'm joined by 4 wonderful panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. They can tell their stories a heck of a lot better than I can. So, Mr. Chet Adkins, would you want to kick us off? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I was born here in Anchorage, 1960, back when the Providence Hospital was down at the corner of 9th and L. I grew up between the lower Kuskokwim River and Fairbanks. My happiest years were always with my grandparents in the village. I grew up and I followed my father down a kind of a dubious path. As a result, between 18 and 55, I spent a little under 30 years incarcerated. It took me a little while to get my, as I put it, pull my head out of my posterior and try to get my life in order. And I've been, since I've been out for 6 years now, I'm on parole. Unless things change, I'll be on parole until 2037. And my goal now is to, help other people that are getting out in the same way that I was helped, meeting them where they're at and help them through the things that they're going through.
Thank you, Chet. I appreciate you sharing your story. We're going to dive into that in a little bit. Let's toss to Sentan. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, good. I remember to unmute. If not, I sometimes just keep talking when nobody can hear me. Well, thank you all for inviting me to be a participant here. First of all, I'm a last minute fill in because they actually had a more eminent person, but she couldn't make it. So, they said, Sen, let's throw him in there and see what he can do. I just want to make sure that you all understand I'm here in my capacity as a private citizen. I had formerly been a judge. I've been retired for 7 years. But before that, I was a Superior Court judge here in Anchorage. And before that, I also worked at the AG's office. And before that, I served as an assistant public defender for 7 years. But I really started my career here in Alaska in 1981. I was in law school at Northeastern University. And before I even went to law school, I was involved in a sentencing project in Massachusetts. During the early 70s, late 70s and early 80s, there was a huge movement towards what they call disparate sentencing. People of color were getting longer sentences, so there was this whole move to look into disparate sentencing, and that's how I came up to Alaska in 1981, in the summer of 81, 40 years ago, almost to this month. I came and I worked for the Judicial Council where they were doing a sensing study. So started a long time ago looking into this issue. And, through my years, I've had experience. Again, although I have been a judge, I'm a private citizen. The other thing I want to mention is, although I'm on the board of the ACLU, I'm not speaking for the ACLU in any capacity. The staff of the agency, they do the speaking. I'm here because I guess, I have been an observer over the years, for 40 years now, of this issue of criminal justice. And as I said, as a last minute fill in, maybe I have something to add. Not very sure, but thank you all for inviting me.
We're so glad you're here, Sen. Thank you for joining us. I'm sure you have a lot of important things to say tonight, so I appreciate it. Mr. Rex Butler, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you. I'm Rex Butler. I've been a criminal defense attorney since 1983. I'm basically a trial lawyer. That's what I do. But the practice of law as a criminal defense lawyer does involve a number of other things. And I've been in Alaska since 1983. Visit first in 82, summer of 82, and returned. I'm a Howard University Law School grad. And, I've been frustrated with, the jail prison system for a long time. And I'm happy to be on the panel. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Rex. Last but certainly not least, Mr. Jonathan Pistonik. Jonathan, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan Pistonik. I'm the coordinator for the Anchorage Reentry Coalition. A lot of familiar faces here this evening, so that's really great. So I do community organizing around prisoner reentry efforts here in Anchorage. And don't hold it against me. I've only been in Alaska for about 3.5 years, but I've been in this position 3 years as of next week. So I'm getting up to speed with everything and the issues that we face here in this sphere of reentry. I first got involved in prisoner reentry efforts back in 2007, actually, through an AmeriCorps Vista opportunity in San Diego. It was kind of neat. The DA's office had some prisoner reentry community organizing kind of efforts down there. So I had an opportunity to get involved. And so I've kind of been in and out of this space since then, but I was fortunate to land this gig as the coalition coordinator. So happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us. And actually thank all of you for joining us. You each bring such unique perspectives to this conversation. I'm excited you're all here. I think it's really important. So we're going to dive right into all of that, but just a couple housekeeping things first. Please mute yourself if you're not speaking. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. My colleague and the ACLU of Alaska's Advocacy Director, Mike Garvey, is also hanging out with us tonight, and he'll be tracking your questions. We're going to save time for questions at the end, but maybe if I'm successful at multitasking, we'll be able to squeeze a couple of those in throughout the conversation. So we've got a lot to talk about, only 90 minutes. I think we should just jump right in. So today, there's about 4,500 people incarcerated in Alaska's jails and prisons, and many others under the Department of Corrections supervision through electronic monitoring, parole and probation, and living in transitional housing, which most of you probably know as halfway houses. And a lot of those contracts are operated and owned by the for-profit prison industry. Incarceration numbers in Alaska are growing rapidly, and as is the impact of mass incarceration on Alaskans. By 2025, the Department of Corrections projects about 5,400 people will be incarcerated. That's a growth of about 1,000 people in about 4 years. To deal with overcrowding, the state made a brief attempt to find yet another private prison contract in the lower 48 to ship Alaskans to. Luckily, that hit a roadblock, but now instead, the state is expected to reopen another prison next month instead of providing services that reduce crime and victimization on the front end, and or by giving currently incarcerated people a meaningful opportunity for release. We're going to dive into that as best as we can. That's a lot to cover in 90 minutes, but we're going to do our best. Chet, I think we should start with you a little bit. Often when I'm talking to people about prison and the people who live inside of them, it's very clear to me that their ideas about it are shaped from like television and these like tough on crime talking points that politicians give them to get votes, but it's not very accurate to the true prison experience or the experience of a person interacting with the criminal legal system. Chet, you know what it's like to lose your freedom, end up in state custody, and have to start all over. And I think it would be really helpful for our audience tonight to understand what it's like for a human to have to endure spending time in a prison. Could you explain a little bit, provide that context?
I mean, it's boring. It's a waste of resources, both human and monetary. I know that that my time incarcerated, I got an AA degree. I did a lot of college credits, but I got absolutely no support from the Department of Corrections. It was to the point that when I actually got parole, I had a date that was 2 years away, and I would go to a PO and ask for help to do this, and they said, you'll get help close to your release date, which was in 2020. My parole date at that time had no effect on what services I may or may not get. I understand that's changed now. Probably one of the biggest changes that has happened is that you tell somebody they're bad and they're violent for long enough, they'll start believing you. When I started my incarceration, Alaska was a very, what was called a weak system. There wasn't a whole lot of violence. There was a few fights here and there. We were sent out of state for 18 years. 15 of those years we were in Arizona, exposed to other contracts, California and New Mexico and Oregon were number ones that were, more violent. And those are the people that taught us, or should have accelerated, a downhill slide that we're probably on already, but we got a lot more violent. The gangs started. That's where a lot of the gangs were formed. Up till then there had been cliques, but no organized gangs. That's where the organizing started. And I know that was getting bigger when I got out in 2015. I got to the halfway house in 2014, but from what I understand, that's really exploded, and things are a lot more predatory than they were. But the biggest issue is, there is no real effort to help somebody change that wants to change. I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. I think it's helpful. You said it was boring. When I talk to currently incarcerated people, I've heard this a few times over. It's like you're living your life on repeat day after day. And it's this dehumanizing sort of experience that makes it really hard to be successful. I mean, could you speak to a little bit about what like the day-to-day routine was like while you were incarcerated?
You get up in the morning, breakfast, sometimes you go back to bed, maybe go out the yard, but most people spend their days in front of the TV set. That is the ultimate babysitter, just like it is for today's kids in a lot of ways. And the bad part about it is, to make life interesting, you create drama, because otherwise life is so boring that, it's almost not worth doing. So like I said, I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but.
No, I think it's helpful. Like I said, a lot of people, I think, get their ideas about what prison is like from watching TV and just pop culture in general. And that's not super accurate to the actual experience.
Everyone's back to us now.
Could I ask whoever, I hear some background noise, if you could please keep yourself muted if you're not talking, that'd be really helpful to the conversation. I appreciate it. Thank you. So, I want to dig into some of the process points here, but again, to kind of set a tone and a context, Chet, maybe we can start with you, but you've all interacted with the criminal legal system in a different capacity. So I would love to hear Chet, Jonathan, Rex, whoever has something to say, like, what does a person lose when they go to prison? And, and that's like besides their freedom. There's so much more that is lost than their freedom. What kind of explain that?
I'm willing to speak a little bit to that. Having spoken to a number of clients who have gone to jail, I think the biggest loss is family. If you're married or you have a significant other, depending on the length of your sentence, eventually your contact falls off and you lose contact with your significant other, your spouse, sometimes your children. And especially when they were sending Alaskans out of state for that lengthy period of time, how torturous could that be for people who could not get regular visits from family? I think that, at least from what I've been told, that's extremely important to people who are incarcerated, to have family contact, to be able to pick up the phone and call and have people come down and see them. And so I think one of the biggest losses and that's a two-way street. It's not just the person who's an inmate, but also the family themselves, because, hopefully we don't have to imagine being separated from a loved one for years. Now, obviously, people will say, well, the person did something wrong and that's the price you pay. But I also, think that many of the sentences that are handed out are longer than they need to be to get a message across. I realize we have recidivism rates, but, I also tend to believe that if you keep a person incarcerated long enough, you hear the term institutionalization. And obviously that happens sometimes sooner rather than later, and sometimes later rather than sooner. But nevertheless, it's a factor that I don't think we really take into consideration when they're meting out sentences. And I just think that we need to have more options so that, families don't get lost as much as they do. Children don't lose their parents as much for as longer than really I think is necessary. And another quick pet peeve, and I'm going to pass the mic on, is the fact that they were taking programs out of the jail, and I've always felt that if you've got some kind of system, we use Zoom now, but if you got, they've had other closed circuit systems, you could teach. You could have speakers for an hour or something, talk to people and just, educate people so that when they come out, they can hit the ground running rather than keep reducing programs. So anyway, what do you lose? I think the biggest thing is your family connections. Thank you.
Thanks, Rex. And, just an interesting anecdote while we're talking about it, we just had Father's Day and Spring Creek has been locked down without phones for a week. That's 500 people who haven't been able to talk to their loved ones in a week. And a lot of them are fathers who are unable to talk to their children on Father's Day. And I just learned that and I felt relevant. So Chet, what are your thoughts? We've talked a little bit about it. What are your thoughts on what a person loses? And maybe if you could touch more on the impact on loved ones and families as well.
Well, I agree with Rex that one of the big things is that family contact. Probably the biggest thing I lost was I couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel the first few years, and I lost my humanity. I became what they told me I was. I became that predatory being that took advantage of other people. In my process of getting my life in order, one of the things I had to come to terms with is that if what I say and what I do don't match up, excuse my language, I'm full of crap. I'm either lying to other people to keep doing what I've always done, or I'm lying to myself. And I use that as a gauge for most people that I interact with. And with the Department of Corrections, since I think back in the 70s, they've said that they recognize that the people that have close family ties have greater success. It's in the P&Ps. But then they ship us out of state. I was out of state from January of 95 until May of 2013. I was out 18 years. You say family is important to rehabilitation and success when you get out, but you limit phone calls. You make it too expensive to call your family to talk to them. You make it more difficult to have a visit. You subject the families to shame and humiliation just to come in the building. So I have real questions about DOC's true intent when it comes to trying to get people rehabilitated and get them, give them a chance to get their life in order. But the biggest thing I lost in that process is humanity. When I went in, my daughter was 9 and my son was 7. When I got out, they were in their 30s. Yes, I lost a connection, but that's my fault. That's not DOC's fault. Okay. Where DOC aggravated the situation was they sent me to Arizona, where in the period of 15 years, I had 4 visits. Okay. I would talk to my kids as often as I could, but I never saw them. I never held them. I never had that physical contact. I had grandkids that were 15, 16 years old before I was, in the same room with them. So, those tangibles are I think a cost that we pay in a lot of ways. And a lot of it is with recidivism and the family trauma that gets passed on. I inherited my father's and grandparents' trauma, and then I passed it on to my kids by not being there for them. So that's the cost of the family. My kids are carrying my burden because 1, I gave it to them, and 2, the state made it worse by sending me out of state.
Thank you, Chet. Jonathan, as somebody who works with people re-entering society after incarceration, do you have anything, I guess, to add, things that have been lost while they were incarcerated that you've noticed? In addition to family?
My first thought when you raised the question was like family and social bonds, that gets lost in being connected to a larger community. I guess one of the things that struck me when I go down to Spring Creek is I hear them talk about how they're lost and forgotten people. And that's kind of a message that really resonated with me, is like they just want to be acknowledged, but like they still exist. And so I don't know how you like talk about that. Like, what is that? I don't know. Like, to just be relegated and cast off and like sent out to the edge of the wilderness, right? Like the end of the road. So I don't know. I think they lose some of their humanity there.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Sorry, I don't have a articulate way of phrasing that. Like, I don't really know what that is. Like, what is that concept? I'm not really sure.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. It is helpful to the conversation, and I appreciate you bringing it up. So I want to transition a little bit now. There are glaring racial inequities within the criminal legal system, and specifically the prison system. Alaska Native people make up about 39% of the prison population, but only about 18% of the state population. Black people make up about 10% of the prison population and only about 3% of the state population. And in contrast, white people make up about 40% of the prison population, but 65% of the state population. Why are people of color so disproportionately represented in the prison system?
I think that starts in the street, actually. I don't blame the prison system for those disparate numbers. Prison system accepts what the law enforcement in the communities and in the street prosecute. Okay. So I think when you're looking at those kinds of disparaging numbers, you got to start with what happens in the street and the discrimination by law enforcement as it relates to people of color. Because the jail system accepts the people that the judges commit to the Department of Corrections. And you're in that process, you're in that community, if you want to call it that. And so that's my view, is that it starts in the street. That's what I see.
And Rex, I'm gonna maybe pick on you for a minute because you just touched on it. So, a person's journey through the criminal legal system doesn't begin at the day they walk into a pretrial facility. It starts with that initial interaction with the police, which we're really not going to get into tonight. But after that, they're interacting with the courts. And I'll start with Rex, and Sen, if you have anything to add, I would encourage you to maybe follow up. But Rex, as a criminal defense attorney with decades of experience here in Alaska, I think maybe adding some context to what does that process look like for somebody who's beginning their journey in the criminal legal system, facing a criminal charge? And is that experience different for a person of color?
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. John Thomas, God rest his soul, he's passed away now, but I remember he told me once, and he lived in Fairview, this was some years back, and he said, Rex, he said, you can't drive in Fairview after a certain hour without being stopped by police. And I told him, he said, as a Black man, without being stopped by police, I told him BS. Okay, that night, I decided to drive through Fairview. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning, and sure enough, a police officer who was parked kind of in the dark. As soon as I drove by, other cars had driven by. As soon as I drove by, he came out, swept out, and swept up behind me. And of course, ran my tag, and my name came back Rex Butler. So he pulled up alongside of me, and I just waved at him. Okay. If my name had been John something else, I'd have been pulled over. Okay. They're going to be looking for something. Now, was I speeding? No. Was I driving over the line? No, I was sober as I could be. So anyway, so it's stuff like that happens. Okay. And there are many stories. I could go through some of them, but I don't know if you really want me to take that kind of time, but there are lots of stories of situations like that. And this is why I say, I don't really blame judges. Okay. This is what's brought before them. The system does its processing. Judge commits a person to the Department of Corrections, and the Department of Corrections has whatever statistical numbers that come off the street. And that's where this kind of stuff starts. And, so people of color, people look at them more intensely, more closely. I've been through it personally, so I know what I'm talking about. And that's just the way it goes.
And I mean, how does that translate through somebody's trial or their sentencing? Like, how big of a factor is, in your experience, has race played in the severity of somebody's sentence? Because you're absolutely right. Department of Corrections takes people that are handed to them by other, institutions.
So you want to ask me a loaded question. Have I seen judges do things that I felt were influenced by the race of the individual? Well, I'm gonna be honest with you. The answer is yes. Now, will I say any names over the 30 years or so that I'm not going to give you any names. But have I seen stuff like that? You damn right I have. In fact, I remember once going into Judge Murphy's courtroom, retired General Judge Murphy. And I remember I walked in and Judge Murphy says to me, Rex, you notice anything today? And I said, yes, Your Honor. I said, looks like this is minority prosecution day, because as I looked in the box where all the inmates were handcuffed side by side, nothing but minorities. And I appreciated the fact that the judge recognized it. Yes, you see? And, obviously we went on about our business, but he saw it, I saw it, okay? And I see it quite often. Lots of minorities, lots of people of color, natives, blacks, etc. Okay? And so what goes on in my mind, it's what happens on the street, okay? Some people get a pass for minor stuff. Others, we want to search your car, want to find this, find that, etc., okay? That's just the way it goes.
Well, now I'm going to put Sen on the spot. So I'm going to share the love here a little bit. Sen, when we're talking about somebody's sentence, what factors determine somebody's sentence? And I know there's legal bounds here, but if you could shed some light on that.
I can shed some light. There's a case out there called State versus Cheney from the 1970s. All right, what it says is, you got to look at a few things, okay? You got to look at rehabilitation. It's in our Constitution, Article 1, Section 13. You got to look at isolation. You need to keep somebody in jail because they're dangerous. Deterrence of person, deterrence of others. Community condemnation. How bad is this? Do the community standards, have they been violated? And reaffirmation of societal norms. And I'll tell you why this doesn't matter at all. Okay? When you talk about sentences, right? What goes into your mind? Judges are there handing down sentences every day, right? We weigh all these factors and we sentence people. Is that what everybody thinks? Yeah, right? That's why you asked me the question. You want to know the reality of the situation? 90+% of cases end up in Rule 11 pleas. That means plea agreements. Show up Friday morning. I don't know what courtroom now. I've been gone for a few years, but Mr. Butler probably knows, right? Friday morning, you show up and you plead out people from morning till the afternoon. Okay? So when I did a study, and this was in, I think, 2015, 16, when Attorney General Mike Garrity came along. He wanted to ban plea bargaining, sentence bargaining. Okay. He said, we should all take all these cases to trial. He didn't understand that we can barely try not even 10% of the cases. That's how the system works. The system is busted. Okay? So really, who controls the plea agreements? Mr. Butler is absolutely correct. I'll even go further. If we have all read the book, Stamped, there's racism out there, leading to inequalities in our society, leading to policing, leading to prosecutorial discretion, leading to lack of defense attorney resources, leading to no bail. You can't make bail, leading to, even if you're done with your sentences, you don't get parole or probation. So if you really look at it, we can talk about sentencing, but please understand that for 90+% of the cases, the decision is made through charging what prosecutors decide to charge. Okay, so when Attorney General Garrity, because of this case called Jerry Active, it was a terrible case. He was on, I think, on bail or something like that. He killed somebody and all that. So, one bad thing, people want to change the system. And so they tried to change the system. It didn't work because instead of bargaining on sentences, we moved it upstream. We were bargaining charges. There was charge bargaining. You charge more, you charge the highest. I myself believe in a philosophy of parsimony in sentencing, which means you should impose the lowest sentence applicable to the crime, all right, for rehabilitation and all the other factors. But that's not the policy in the state of Alaska. Now you think, well, maybe in 10% of the cases, judges have a lot of discretion now, right? We can do whatever we want. We look at the Cheney criteria. Wrong. In most of the cases, the legislature has come up with set sentences. We are like a cookbook. Is this the first offense? Is this, what class is this? Oh, this is the sentence range. Oh, this is your second offense. Is it A, B, or C? That's where you get. And if it's a B, we have fixed sentences for most serious crimes. Okay. And the question then, and I'm going to get off my soapbox in a while, why is the legislature doing this? In 1981, when I first came up here, right, the number of people, and I went back and looked at the paper, I dug it up, it was about 170 to 180 per 100,000 people incarcerated. Today it's closer to 700. We have gone up 400% per 100,000 people. Why did that happen? And of course, you know, all this presumptive sentencing came about because really they said, oh my goodness, people of color getting longer sentences, let's change it. They increased the sentences for everything. And frankly, if you look back in 1980, the percentage of people of color in prisons per 100,000 has gone up. It hasn't gone down. See? Because if really fixed the problem, then the prison population should reflect our society demographics. So if you ask the question, how much does sentencing play in this role? Actual judicial discretion sentencing, very little. If you include everything, including what the prosecutor does, what the defense attorneys may or may not be able to do, because most people, you know, Mr. Butler is a great attorney. He represents a lot of people, but most of the people who face the criminal justice system are represented by public attorneys, the PDs and OPA and other contract attorneys, okay? And they are, I hate to say it, they're understaffed. So I don't know how to answer the question other than, yeah, sure, there are cases where there have been disparate sentencing. It's always been shown that judges, if left to their discretion, race, whatever it is, does become a factor. How much control does a judge have? I would say very small, very, very small. So I think that sort of is a long way to answer your question.
I appreciate that, Sen. I mean, as you know, as everybody on here has already said, like, DOC is not the sole actor in this mass incarceration and like culture of crime and punishment that we've created here. So I think it provides a lot of context. And I'm just curious, Rex, do you have anything to add to what Sen said or any reaction? I saw you maybe shaking your head a little bit. And so I just want to give you a minute to respond if there's something to say.
Absolutely. Judge Tan mentioned, you know, plea bargaining and how 90+% of cases plea out. And like he said, if that didn't happen, the system would collapse under its own weight, okay? You don't have enough judges, you don't have enough prosecutors, you don't have enough defense lawyers. And like I say, you know, public defenders and public advocate lawyers, they're good lawyers. They know the law, they know the criminal justice system as well as anybody. But you put enough work on their table, they cannot be effective without those resources, okay? It's just that simple. And judges have been crippled by legislators who get political gain by being tough on crime. You know, it seems like the state spent all that money, you know, creating a whole new system with SB 91. It lasted 2 years before new administration came in, kicked it all out after all that money spent, millions, and went back to the old system, never giving that particular system a chance to operate, to really get up off the ground, okay? You know, so anxious to, well, incarceration. So now they're gonna be open, I understand, Palmer Correctional Center. They're gonna put more people out there, and then eventually they'll get some money. And you know, Goose Creek, they got 2 more sections to build on to Goose Creek out there. Okay, they're gonna get around to it when when the oil prices go up. Okay, and like someone said, it ain't about, you know, really rehabilitation in the jails, which is what it's supposed to be. You see, jail, yes, it's supposed to be about punishment, isolation, rehabilitation. It's supposed to be a primary goal. That's changed a little bit, you know, because our Constitution has been changed where victims' rights takes you know, a front lead on that now. But the fact of the matter is when you think of rehabilitating a person to become a non-offending member of society, that's what the goal is. What do? You understand what I'm saying? You've got to have a carrot and a stick. And there's more stick than carrot, as has been articulated in part by Mr. Atkins, you know, who's got enough experience to really teach us something about what should happen in jails in terms of rehabilitation. But we know for a fact that when budgets have to be cut, where did the cut start? The cut starts with taking programs out of DLC. At the same time, you're increasing the number of people going into DLC. You see, now, one other thing I want to say, as Judge Tan mentioned, quite frankly, the prosecutors have so much discretion. And the thing that gets me sometimes about some of the young prosecutors who don't know a damn thing about life, okay, but they have all this tremendous power. And when it comes down to these Rule 11 agreements, yes, sure, as a criminal defense lawyer, I bargained for what I can get for a client, but in the end, the state, the prosecutors are ready to shove down the defendant's throat what they want them to have, okay? And so when they go before a judge with a Rule 11, there's not a lot for a judge to do, because in Alaska, judges don't modify these Rule 11s. They either agree or disagree with them. And if they were to start really, really disagreeing with these Rule 11s, again, the system would collapse under its own weight. I hope I answered the question.
You did. You gave us a lot. I'm going to pick it apart here shortly, but I saw Chet, I think you might have unmuted yourself. And so I wanted to know if there was something that you would like to add before we move along.
I think there is without question racial bias that is taught to us subliminally as Americans. You know, I hate to say it. I had to confront my own racist ideas that I didn't know I had when my first grandchild was born. And it shows up in a lot more places than just the criminal system. I have watched a number of people in mixed marriages going through divorce processes where judges are very quick to believe stereotypical accusations for the minority, and when an accusation is made against the Caucasian part of the party, they want proof. So the prejudice is there, and I agree that the legislature is the driving force in what's happening to our prison system and to our people. But once we get past that, we got to start dealing with the whys of what we do, why we do what we do. Okay, and that comes down to trauma, and we got to start dealing with the generational trauma of the natives. All the minorities have got a lot of generational trauma that gets passed down from one generation to the next without even knowing it. And we have to, you know, deal with what's happening here. But if we want to fix the problem, we got to make it a social issue and deal with generational trauma. That's what I have to say.
Thanks, Chet. And just for context, I'm unaware of I'm unaware of any programming within the Department of Corrections that, that's cultural rehabilitation at any capacity. Jonathan, Chet, are you guys aware? Has that program been created? And I'm, out of touch here.
There is nothing that is currently being offered. However, the Family Wellness Warriors at South Central Foundation are working on creating a culturally focused RSAT type TC in Palmer when it's open.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd just add that you might be able to find some elements from community-based organizations that are delivering program inside, but DOC-driven initiatives, I'm not really aware of any of that kind of thing. But there could be. I mean, what happens in these far-flung prisons and institutions are all over the state. Like, there's so much that happens, and like sometimes it's so insular, it's really hard to like really get an understanding of like what's actually taking place. And you might read something on an email or a document or whatever, and it's like, well, actually that information is 5 years old. So
Yeah, and it might not be the same at like every prison. It's different depending on where you are. So after somebody's sentenced, the punishment is the loss of freedom, and it's DOC's job and the incarcerated person, but it's DOC's job to provide rehabilitative opportunities to thousands of people under their supervision. But I think there's a conflict within, the conversation on prison reform. Is it DOC's job to punish people or rehabilitate? And I would also say that there's conflict between administrations, depending on what administration is at the helm. So I'd ask our panelists, is it DOC's job to punish or rehabilitate?
Let me just step into this, okay? The US model is punishment-based, all right? If we look at the number of people incarcerated in this country and you compare it to the rest of the world, we are ahead of all of the European countries, Russia, Iran, Cuba, you can go down the list, okay? We're way, way up there. Almost 700 people per 100,000. All right, we believe in the punishment model, not in the rehabilitation model. Okay, so yes, although the Alaska Constitution talks about rehabilitation, and Rex is correct in that in 1994, when they came up with this victims' rights amendment to the Constitution, they changed it a bit. But although it's in our Constitution, the Alaska Constitution, it's not the model. The bright spot was SB 91, which tried to change the model, as with many other states, with great success, towards a rehabilitation model. Let me tell you why that is so important and it's not being done. If you look at the prison population and you look at who's in there, about a third of the people are there because of drug and alcohol addiction problems. Another third actually are people with mental health disorders. DOC is the largest purveyor of psychiatric drugs in the state. So if you want to talk about rehabilitation, we have to have proper rehabilitation services targeted at, I would say, if you add it up, 50 to 60% of the population need rehabilitation and help, but we don't do it, all right? We dispense huge amounts of psychiatric drugs. We do not have treatment programs or adequate treatment programs for drug and alcohol addiction. And then we believe that we can punish addiction and it would cure the problem. That has been shown to have been an absolute failure. The whole war on drugs has been a failure. That's one thing. And the other thing also, you cannot punish somebody with a mental disorder to effectuate change. That does not work. The court system has tried various things. We have done all these things called therapeutic courts and all that. but it only affects a small number of people. Okay, but the rehabilitation model is not what is being applied in DOC. SB 91 tried to change it. It lasted 2 years. And then basically there was a backlash, right? House Bill 49 came along, and not only did they repeal SB 91, they increased sentences and took away the money for the rehabilitation. So I hope that answers the question. We need treatment. If there's going to be a change in, I would say, the view of rehabilitation, we need to really think about problem solving, and understand that punishment does not solve the problem.
Thank you, Sen. Chet, I see you're unmuted. Jump right in.
Okay, might get myself in trouble here, but the purpose of DOC is self-perpetuation. No matter what, they say the cardinal rule of corrections is security. I disagree. The cardinal rule of Alaska corrections is cover your ass, because if you don't cover your ass, somebody's going to stab you in the back and use you to climb the ladder. The perfect example of that is Bill Lipinskis down in Spring Creek. He was affecting lives. He was helping people be successful, getting them ready to be successful. And for his effort, he got villainized and fired. So the cardinal rule of correction is self-perpetuation. It always has been. So that's what, they may not admit it, but that is how they see their purpose. They have their own interests, that no matter what we tell them we want, they have their own interests.
Thanks, Chet. We're getting some really great questions in the chat here, and I haven't missed them. I'm paying attention to them, especially things about parole. We're going to get to that in a minute, but we just got a question, and Sen, maybe you could respond to this from Trevor Stefano. So and he explains that, Article 1, Section 12 of the Alaska Constitution says Alaska's prisoners' right to rehabilitation. Nowhere is rehabilitation defined by statute or DOC policy. So how is it assessed when it's not defined?
For a brief shining moment, it was actually defined in SB 91. All right. That was actually part of the statute that was repealed, dealt with rehabilitation and the need for it. But you are absolutely right. At this time, rehabilitation is just a word that has no definition. It is a black box. It is basically open to interpretation. As I already said, if you really want to go back to the old days of why we lock people up, and actually I have a law degree from England, so I know a little bit about English history, is this. You lock people up and you gave them the Bible, and you locked them up and made them read the Bible. And by coming to whatever religion, and at that time, of course, it was the Anglican Church, you were supposed to be rehabilitated. You're right, there is no definition, okay? But if you really want to talk about rehabilitation based on the best available information, I would say, instead of spending $50,000, or actually it's probably closer to $52,000 now per prisoner per year, okay? Let's build treatment facilities all over the state. Let's build mental health clinics all around our neighborhoods where people can get what they need, and crime would drop. This has been successful in other states, by the way. You can look at New Jersey, even Texas has experimented with this. This is how we can deal with rehabilitation. And the other thing, has nothing to do with, we also lock up, as I saw some earlier comment here, we lock up a lot of people before trial. We all mouth this idea of presumption of innocence, okay? But we really don't like it. We like to say you're charged with a crime, you must be guilty. SB 91 again tried to do that, was to de-incarcerate a lot of people pre-trial. Guess what? That didn't work. Okay, there was a huge uproar and they took all that away. So who gets locked up? You're absolutely right. Okay, people of color and people of the lower socioeconomic strata you cannot afford bail. When I first was a public defender, the whole idea of third-party custodian, especially for misdemeanors, was unheard of. But now it's the norm. You can't get out of jail unless you have somebody vouching for you. So yes, so there are many aspects that we can talk about. And in answer to Mr. Stefano's question, it is not defined as I know it. It's just basically a big concept out there.
Thank you, Sen. Now, Jonathan, you've been kind of quiet. I'm going to pick on you. We're talking a lot about rehabilitation. First, before we talk about that, you mentioned your work in reentry, but I think for context, I want to jump into the substance, but could you explain what reentry is?
Yeah, it's funny. I was in a meeting with a member of the legislature doing some advocacy work a couple months ago. And apparently the invite, it wasn't prefaced like what reentry meant. And he said at the beginning of the meeting, he's like, oh, I thought this was about like immigration or something. So obviously I think everybody knows we're talking about prisoner reentry, who's here tonight. But, reentry is sort of like this process, this act that an individual goes through when they're leaving corrections. I think it's implied that they've been convicted of something and now they're being released back into the community. So it's like this individual journey. And it's this process that somebody goes through. But reentry is also, I think it encompasses the services and the resources that play a part in successful reentry, like assisting somebody in that process. So whether it's the DMV or employers that are willing to offer jobs or a place that will rent to somebody or offer housing, the social service providers that help guide people through this process, they're part of reentry also. And I mean, for me, I approach this through a public health social justice lens, so like I can make a connection to a whole lot of stuff as to like why it's important and how it plays a role into this. But I would also offer that I think that reentry encompasses the policies that exist out there that either facilitate successful reentry or either straight up ignore it or maybe even prohibit, like create barriers to that process to helping people, be successful in that journey. So I think I see it through like a really ecological lens. Like it's not just like one person doing a thing. It's like all of these resources and all of these things in the community that like are involved in reentry.
Yeah, a wise peer who I think is on this call told me over and over again, reentry starts the day somebody walks into jail. And, as somebody who's interacting with people when they're returning to our communities, this might be a loaded question, but do you think, are they getting what they need to be successful while they're incarcerated? And if the answer is no, what resources and programs are missing? And Jonathan, I'm going to pick on you first, but Chet, I would love to hear your response to that as well.
So when I do my like general reentry presentation, I always have this like bullet point in there that's like, you'll find all these themes amongst the people that become incarcerated and then are ultimately going through this reentry process. So you'll find prevalence of trauma and prior drug and alcohol use and low socioeconomic status and poverty. But like not everybody is in all of these dire situations. Like there are people that become incarcerated that have college degrees, that are highly skilled and have a whole ton of financial resources before they go into the correctional system. So like some people, I think they find what they need to be successful while they're incarcerated. Like I've met people that have said, yes, like going to jail helped me for whatever reason. But there's a lot of people who I think it's a huge, I don't know, it causes such a disruption and they don't find the help or the resources or whatever like that guiding light is that would help them when they get released. So, I mean, for some people, I'd say yes, they probably do get the treatment or the programming that helps them. But I think that on the whole, there's a deficit and that there's not enough programming, and we definitely could use more, and intensity and also like quantity, I think, are part of it. And then also I'll just add that, like, I think it's easy. I always default to like men because, like, I think 90% of our whole correctional system is men. Nationally, I'm not sure what the statistic is, but women, like, you can't just say like, oh, we're just going to throw all these programs at corrections. Like, well, no, like, which institution? Who are you talking about? Men, women? Are they old, young? Like, you kind of need to like really hone in on like the types of programming that we're talking about too, and making sure they're relevant, for everyone.
Chet?
Okay, in my opinion, true reentry starts when the individual decides to change, decides to be a better person. The way I put it, I chose to be the person I was created to be rather than the person I chose to be. Okay, I made that change. But when you make that decision, there's really nothing on the inside to help you. You can possibly get into one of the TLC programs that are faith-based programs that are helpful. But if you're not a Christian and that's not your path, it's not helpful. I don't even know if there's an RSAT program, a residential substance abuse program. I believe there's some LSATs, but I don't know if there's an RSAT. There are no real resources in there that I'm aware of that, one, teach you a skill, and two, teach you how to deal with problems in a healthy way. And that's the hardest part. When you run into a problem, your primary coping mechanism has either been violence or crawling into a bottle of something, whether it's alcohol or drugs. None of those things are being addressed. So I don't think there's anything that's really substantive that's happening on the inside. There's a lot of Band-Aids and a lot of, pseudo programs, but I don't know of anything that's really happening.
Thanks, Chet. I just want to highlight a comment from Trevor again. And he says in the chat, the issue needs to be addressed through the way that DOC houses can bind citizens together. A prisoner can engage in all rehabilitative programs that exist in the prison and be housed with other prisoners who could care less about self-betterment and programs. This makes it difficult to elevate and maintain rehabilitative gains. Unit housing should be asked in this context. And I actually want to highlight, but before the administration changed, at the early change of the administration, what Trevor is describing here actually did exist at Spring Creek. It was a program-based housing unit that they called the reentry mod, and that was the idea, that everybody in there contributed and did programming. And it was one of the first things that was undone when the new administration came in. And I think now is a good time to pivot, though, because we're talking a lot about rehabilitation and reentry, but I think we should acknowledge, though, that it seems through numbers and stats and, and even stories that we're being told, the opportunities for release are becoming harder and harder to achieve. Recently, there was numbers revealed about a severe decline in the amount of people that were being granted discretionary parole through the parole board. And in fact, actually in an interview related to that story, the director of the parole board said a lack of programming during COVID-19, because all programming was pretty much ceased during COVID-19, is going to impact parole. So, I guess Sen, Rex, I would be interested in your perspectives on, the lawfulness of the state to deny discretionary parole to people because the state failed to uphold its constitutional duty to the right to rehabilitation. And how do we fix that? Because it seems to me, when I talk to incarcerated people who've been denied, they don't feel like they have a lot of legal options or other avenues to fight that. So I would love to hear your perspective on that issue. And I think it's also really important to name that people of color are being denied discretionary parole at much higher rates than white people who are currently incarcerated.
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know a lot about what's going on inside the jail as it relates to that. But if it's true that people of color are being granted fewer opportunities than others, then something is wrong. If that's known, the question is, why isn't it being fixed? Is it because of the current administration? Is it because of whoever is the superintendent of the jails? Are people bringing this information to the attention of people who can do something? I suspect they are. And if they aren't doing something, then I suspect the remedy is going to be in the courts, because people who have power don't surrender power. They keep it and they try to get more power. And so those who have power over the Department of Corrections, those power brokers, they're not going to give up power. So how do you balance the playing field, if you will? I mean, it seems like your remedy is in the courts, which is going to be a long and expensive fight that nobody's going to want to pay for. And so do people just sit there and suffer because of that? I honestly don't know. I mean, we've got questions here I can't answer.
And this is from long ago in my memory banks, from way, way back when I was a public defender. And I'm talking about the 80s right now. I actually appeared before the parole board. One has to realize that the parole board is part of the executive branch of government. It is an administrative board, and it's got tremendous, tremendous discretion, okay? There's executive director, and then there are parole board members, and then you vote on it. And so, yes, have I seen different, shall I say, boards act differently? Yeah, some are much more permissive than others. Now, when you ask what's the remedy, okay, if you are denied parole, you can file an administrative appeal to the courts, okay? You can do that. Chances are, boy, to those who have some legal thought process, the standard of review of a board decision is very little. Courts can't substitute their judgment. They just say, well, did you all make a reasonable decision? Are there some facts to back it up? That's basically it in an administrative appeal. Now, is there a systemic issue that requires, I would say, some sort of overall class action lawsuits? Well, we can get to it later, but long ago in a faraway place and time, there was a prison suit called Clary, right? It basically was a class action. And you know what happened after Clary won? The legislature stepped in and said, you can't do that no more. Okay, so yeah, I'm not sure. I really haven't looked into exactly what can you do when people are denied parole and there are issues. So yeah, the parole is a very interesting discretionary administrative function of the DOC.
That's helpful. I think we could probably have an entire conversation on issues with parole and early release. And certainly we all need to learn a lot more information, but Sen, we have a question here, and perhaps you can answer it, perhaps not, but is it a conflict of interest? And thank you for Terry for sending the question, but is it a conflict of interest for the mother of a victim of a crime to sit as the chair of the parole board, especially considering that her son's trial and sentencing continue? It's a question I think that's on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, I haven't looked at the statute or the regulations governing service on the parole board. But in many instances, when people feel like they cannot be fair, right, and they experience that there's a conflict of interest, they should not participate in being the except the adjudication function. Okay, I don't know. I mean, if you're, well, I don't know this person well enough. However, I had a very good friend because he passed away. His grandmother was killed by somebody and was executed, and he spent the rest of his life working against the death penalty. Okay, so there are exceptional people like that. However, you know, if from a judicial point of view, because we have a code of conduct, a set of rules that we have to follow, if this was a judge, you know, a judge would probably say, yep, this is not the type of case I want or am qualified to sit on. Okay, because basically this is something that is very personal and I should not be the judge in this case. I don't know what the standards are with respect to the parole board. Don't know.
Thanks, Sen. You know, another thing that, you know, I'm hearing from a lot of people as recently as this week, that people who are being released or granted parole dates, they're years down the road, like 8 years down the road. And these are people who have found a bed, they've found a job, they have found treatment. So I would be curious to hear some perspectives of when decisions like that are handed down after that, you know, they've done their programming, they've checked all the boxes, they've made that release plan, and then they get like an 8-year hit before they can actually go. How detrimental is that going to be to their success and continued rehabilitation? And I understand there's probably like not a way to quantify that, but in your experiences, how has that impacted people? And Jonathan, I would be curious to hear from you, like, is when you're doing in-reach and you're talking to folks, is this something that has to be considered? Like, this is a bed that's going to be not going to be available in 8 years, maybe. I don't know.
To be honest, this isn't something that's really come up for me. This is kind of new territory for me personally to encounter this kind of situation. So I don't know, Chet might have some insight.
When I was granted parole, my date was 2 years away. And at that time, that was an unusual thing. And I can tell you that even though it was, you know, something that where I could see the light at the end of the tunnel, it created a lot of stress because you're in an environment where there are people that want to sabotage that don't like to see other people get out, and they will do things to try to sabotage you. Or they will take advantage of you because you can't defend yourself. So it creates a lot of stress. It creates it's a setup to fail. And something that I will add to my recent experience and with a number of some of the guys that are getting out now, I think a percentage of them are people that the parole board expects to fail. So they can use that statistic. I know that, these are guys that, have the habit of self-sabotaging. And I'm thinking, and I've talked to them about it, but I think that the parole board is setting people up to fail when they do grant parole. And I think granting somebody, parole 6 to 8 years down the road is setting them up to fail.
Thank you, Chet. So I want to start to wrap up the conversation so we have time to hopefully answer some of the questions that are coming in. But before we do, I guess I have a very big, ominous question for everybody on this panel. Our prisons are overcrowded. Conditions, I would say, are inhumane, demoralizing, however you want to put it. And the public is often told that this is a good thing, that this is the path that's going to make us better or safer. So to our panelists tonight, is the current model of mass incarceration as a fix-all for all of our problems making us better, safer? Is it working?
When my son was in high school, he had a big folder, okay? On top of the folder, he had this wonderful graphic that say, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, and you expect different results, that's a definition of insanity, okay? We I just want to say the public perception of what is going on and the reality of what is going on is very divergent. For example, New York Times really asked this question: what's the most dangerous city in the country? Over 50% of people said Chicago, right? Because former President Trump, or for some people, he's still President Trump, asserted that Chicago was the place of carnage. Chicago doesn't even make it into the first 5. Chicago is number 7. The most dangerous city in this country is St. Louis. Okay, followed by Baltimore, Detroit, New Orleans, Cleveland, Kansas City, Cincinnati, Milwaukee, and then Chicago. Now, when you ask, how dangerous is New York City? My goodness, New York City, top 10. It is so far down, it is below Seattle. See, public perception and reality of homicides is totally divergent. St. Louis, Missouri has 3 times more homicides than Chicago. But nobody talks about that, okay? So there's this public perception thing. We believe that the war on drugs is a good thing, starting with President Reagan. Remember that? Just Say No. There's a great book written out there called Chasing the Scream by Jonathan Hari. And he basically says the war on drugs is a total failure. And incarceration rates went up dramatically over the 80s and 90s because we kept passing more and more draconian laws for drug possession. Now we've decriminalized marijuana, but during that period, I don't know how many people got locked up for possession of marijuana, even though in Alaska you were allowed to possess some amount under Raven versus State. Okay, so there's this big issue, and we lock up a lot of people. The recidivism rate in Alaska before SB 91 was 67%. After SB 97, they actually dived, but now it's coming back up because we've gone back to the same policies. Okay, it's a failure because we are going back to the same system that did not work. A lot of people say, wait a moment, Sen, you're stupid. Okay, I'm stupid. I've been told that numerous times. It's just, crime has dropped over time because we've locked up more people. QED, Sen, locking up people works. And that's where we have this thing called the prison paradox. Numerous studies have been done that show that locking up more people does not make you any safer. Prison population went up, crimes dropped, but the fact is, they said maybe at most 15%, but for most people, it's like that's not even that amount. Okay, the other factors, such as an aging population, better socioeconomics, education, we have a much higher education, high school graduation rate and all that. All the other factors cause the drop in crime. Crime is lower today than it was 20 years ago. Okay, unfortunately, it's come up. Right after COVID, violent crimes have gone up about 30%. It's all over the papers, but it has been dropping steadily. Yet our prison population continues to climb. So there is something fundamentally wrong. I'm going to end up on a good note. Are there solutions to this problem? Yes. 19 states over the past 10 years have reduced their prison population. It can be done. But we need our policymakers, i.e. the legislators, and I include judges. Although, as I'm trying to tell you, we play a very small role. We could play a bigger role, but actually we were on the Criminal Justice Commission. We can change the trajectory, but we need our policymakers not to feed on the fear of the populace. Everybody thinks, my goodness, crime is rising. No, crime has been dropping. Anchorage, we are so far down in terms of dangerous cities. We are like, 45th or something, all right? But the perception is, gosh, everything is dangerous. Fear is the greatest motivator, by the way. So here we are. Instead of finding solutions, Mr. Atkins is right. We are feeding the system. is a self-perpetuating system, and we're feeding it. And it starts throughout the entire system. So I'm going to encourage everybody to get the information and think about it. We can be safer, reduce crime, and this is the best part I'm going to make. And so we can have more money. The DOC budget is $400 million, okay? If we can cut their budget in half, there'll be more money for the PFD. No, I'm serious. That's like the third rail, right? So we can have it all. We can have it all. We are smart, but nobody wants to do it. So anyway, that's my spiel. It is hopeful. It is hopeful. Because there are many groups out there saying mass incarceration is not a solution. And it is bad. And frankly, it is discrimination. It punishes poor people. It punishes people of color. And it doesn't solve any problems. So thank you for letting me jump on my soapbox.
Thank you, Sen. We appreciated it. The rest of our panelists, do you have anything quick to add to the question, is mass incarceration working? I feel like Sen covered a lot of ground there, but if you have anything to add.
Yeah, our political leaders have a habit of wanting to kick problems down the road for somebody else to solve. You've got, our national debt is an example. Another example is how we deal with, the incarceration rate and crime in Alaska. When I was first incarcerated in 1987, violence, at least inside, was minimal. Now it's not minimal anymore. It's a growing problem. So you are releasing a much more violent person to society than you put in. You're locking up people, and you're releasing people with no hope, that don't see any other choice but to be who you told them they are, and commit new crimes and go back to jail. If you keep telling somebody that they're bad, sooner or later they're going to start believing you and just give up. So the idea that we're making ourselves safer in the long run is a fantasy. I experienced it. I lived it. It's wrong. It's making people a lot more dangerous.
Thank you, Chet. We're going to take, Jonathan?
Just real quick, I think that based on my unscientific research, I think that the fact that Alaska is reopening a prison, Palmer Correctional, that's really counter to what's happening nationally. So in some ways, we're kind of moving backwards. We're increasing our capacity to incarcerate in Alaska rather than lowering our capacity. We're not finding solutions to keep our community safe. We're just finding ways to increase our ability to incarcerate more people. So I'm not optimistic about that. I'm disappointed that the Reentry Coalition leadership that I'm part of, like around the state, didn't make more of an uproar, like voicing displeasure with this outcome. But this is partly the decision of our lawmakers that the state of Alaska has voted into office. So some of this is on us as a state, as a community. So I think it's not the right way to go, though, to answer your question, Megan, about mass incarceration.
Thank you. So Anthony Perry, I saw you had your hand up a little bit ago. I don't know if you got tired of holding it up, but if you still have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and jump right in.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks everybody. I really, I know what I missed. I've been back out here in society for 10 years now, and I was incarcerated in the federal system for 15 years in the penitentiary level, and out of that time, I spent time in the control units at Florence in Colorado. And up until my last year and a half of incarceration, the thing about incarceration and it's survival. So, moral reasoning is, until I got separated, I got into a program and I'll be brief. I got into a program my last year or so because I realized that I was in a penitentiary system that only 25, 30% of the people, my peers, if you will, only 25% of us even had a release date. And so in that setting, rehabilitation and programming is a hard pill to swallow. It is. What I missed, and it took me years of therapy when I got out. It took me years of alcohol abuse to deal with that. You know, the old saying, 10 miles in the woods, 10 miles to the back. That is true with incarceration. And what I missed in there was mental health treatment. That is what I missed. When I was able to get into that program, and the only reason they put us in that program was to control us to live to be less violent in prison, you know, and I was getting out, but I got an invite and got in there. But, you know, in my opinion, I think that there should be more safe places to be able to get the reentry. You know, I got out, just the federal system, and I didn't get any therapy because, you know, any counseling or anything like that. I had to beg for them to get it, and I did get it. And then in the end, I ended up having to pay for it. But there was no real safe place for me to look at, hey, I'm going to get out of prison. Because there was a point where there was no reason to get out of prison for Tony. I was set up there. I knew it. I didn't even know how to operate a cell phone or anything when I got out. And no clue. I'd been gone too long. You know, I hadn't had a visit for 10 years of my incarceration. So my visual stimuli was what I seen in a violent society that I lived in. And I didn't get any, you know, I got a lot. Therapy or mental health in the federal system or in the maximum security prison is medication. I was forced to take it, and I was asked, you know, to take it. And it's a form of controlling and dummying you down. There is no rehabilitation in that form of mental health, you know, therapy. I'm glad to be here tonight. I saw this, you know, I live in Juneau now. It took a long time. You know, I started out in South Carolina, and I live in Juneau now. But mental health, you know, when somebody mentioned early in this panel that, you know, mental health, you know, we know it. We know over half of the incarcerated individuals, male, female, people of color, it doesn't matter, across the board, they suffer from mental health. Yeah. Our asylums are the penal systems, you know, and you're talking about, you know, for money. Well, you know, my first 8.5 years, I was in USP Atlanta, where they make all of the mattresses and box springs for the entire military of the world globally, and all of the BDU pants and battle dress uniforms, and we made them. Yeah. And we made them, and USP Atlanta is one of the highest rate of heroin overdoses in the system, because they let us have all that because we sew those pants and build those mattresses. Yeah. So anyways, thanks for having me, Megan. Yeah, of course. Thank you for joining us and sharing your story. We got a question really early on that I'm hoping maybe somebody could answer. But what role are tribal courts playing in rehabilitation? You know, and I guess even one further, like, what role do tribal courts play in Alaska?
I don't have the latest information, but for a while there, the Alaska court system, through one of the processes, we were partnering with tribal courts on restorative justice. And in fact, I believe in the Kenai, with the Kanaitsi tribe, there was in cases where one of the tribal court justices sat with a Superior Court judge. I don't know what happened to that. I know Judge Peter Ashman, now deceased, and Judge Eric Smith, they were working on restorative justice in the bush. And that was part of the whole restorative justice is a whole rehabilitation-based model of justice. I don't know where it is now. I have not kept up.
Well, this has been a very good conversation. I loved all of the engagement in the chat. I feel like we could probably talk all night, but we're at 90 minutes exactly. If you guys have any more questions or want to talk about this more, please feel free to reach out to us. There's also a ton of other wonderful community advocates who are working on this on the call tonight. Big shout out to everybody who showed up, including those advocates, our panelists, the Anchorage Library, and the Anchorage Reads program. This barely scraped the surface of what we probably need to talk about, but my hope is that we can continue the conversation. You've all invested 90 minutes of your time with us tonight. That was a huge investment of your life, and I am incredibly grateful. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your night and have a safe weekend.